My name is Lauren. I am 35 years old, and 3 days ago I buried the only man who ever truly loved me. But the real nightmare did not begin at the cemetery. It began hours later when the landlord of a secret house my husband rented called me with a frantic warning. He said he found something I needed to see immediately, and that I could not tell my sister or her fiancé under any circumstances. But before I even got that phone call, I had to survive the country club reception where my own sister decided my husband's funeral was the perfect place to present me with a fake debt for $250,000. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had your grief weaponized by the very people who were supposed to be your family. The Oak Ridge Country Club was a place David and I actively avoided. It smelled of old money, expensive gin, and suffocating expectations. But my parents, William and Susan, insisted on hosting the reception here. They cared more about the optics of a grieving widow than the actual widow herself. I stood near the lavish buffet staring at a silver platter of poached salmon that made my stomach turn. The room was a blur of black designer suits and subtle diamond jewelry. People I barely knew came up to me offering hollow condolences, their eyes darting away the moment they fulfilled their social obligation. I just nodded, clutching a glass of lukewarm water. My mind was still at the cemetery, replaying the sound of the dirt hitting David's mahogany casket. David was 36, a brilliant corporate compliance officer with a laugh that could fill a stadium. We were supposed to grow old together. We were supposed to have decades. Instead, a sudden medical emergency had ripped him away from me, leaving me entirely adrift in a sea of people who only tolerated my presence. I am a commercial loan underwriter. My entire career is built on analyzing risk, finding logical patterns, and maintaining composure under extreme pressure. But standing in that opulent ballroom, my professional armor was completely shattered. I felt utterly exposed. I just wanted to go home, crawl into his side of the bed, and disappear. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my shaking hands. Across the room, I could see my parents holding court. They were soaking up the sympathy of their wealthy friends, playing the tragic role of the grieving in-laws to perfection. But their eyes were completely dry. Beside them stood Andre, my future brother-in-law. He was a 34-year-old venture capitalist, tall, charismatic, wearing a bespoke, tailored suit that probably cost more than my first car. He had a glass of scotch in one hand and was laughing quietly at something a guest had said. It was sickening. They were treating my husband's memorial service like a networking event. And then the crowd parted. My younger sister Allison began marching toward me. She was 32, the undeniable golden child of our family. Even at a funeral, she looked like she had just stepped off a magazine cover. Her black dress was perfectly fitted, her makeup flawless, her expression fixed in a mask of practiced solemnity. But as a sister who had spent a lifetime on the receiving end of her cruelty, I could see the cold calculation in her eyes. The low murmur of conversations in the room seemed to die down as she crossed the plush carpet. Allison always demanded an audience, and she knew exactly how to capture one. She did not approach me with open arms. She did not offer a shoulder to cry on. Instead, she carried a thick manila folder tucked tightly under her arm. She stopped right in front of me, ensuring we were the absolute center of attention for the surrounding guests. I braced myself for some backhanded compliment or passive-aggressive critique about my appearance. What came next completely derailed my reality. Without a single word of comfort, Allison pulled a crisp legal document from the folder and slammed it down onto the pristine white tablecloth next to the buffet. The sound was surprisingly loud, cutting through the soft jazz playing in the background. I stared at the paper, then back up at her, my vision blurring with fresh tears of confusion. "What is this, Allison?" I asked, my voice cracking under the weight of exhaustion. She sighed loudly, a dramatic sound designed to make her look burdened and patient. "I am so sorry to have to do this today, Lauren. Truly I am. But Andre and I have a wedding to pay for in 2 months, and business is business. That is a promissory note. Your husband owed Andre a significant amount of money, and we need it settled immediately." My brain struggled to process her words. I looked down at the document. It was a formal legal contract complete with notary stamps and signatures. My eyes scanned the bold print at the top, and my heart completely stopped. The principal amount listed was $250,000. I felt all the blood drain from my face. My hands gripped the edge of the buffet table to keep my knees from buckling. $250,000, I whispered, terrified that if I spoke any louder, the entire room would hear. David did not have any debt. We paid off our student loans years ago. We do not even have a car payment. Allison leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a harsh, mocking whisper that only I and the guests immediately adjacent could hear. Well, apparently your perfect husband was not so perfect after all. He came to Andre months ago begging for a bailout. He had massive gambling debts, Lauren, and some incredibly stupid crypto investments that completely tanked. He used Andre's investment firm to cover his tracks. Andre was just trying to be a good family member by helping him out, but we cannot absorb a hit like this. We expect payment by the end of the month. I stood completely paralyzed. The words gambling and crypto echoed in my mind like a horrible joke. David was a compliance officer. He was the most risk-averse human being on the planet. He color-coded our grocery budget and refused to buy lottery tickets because the statistical probability was a waste of $1. The idea that he was secretly gambling hundreds of thousands of dollars was mathematically and psychologically impossible. But there it was, sitting on the table with what looked exactly like his signature. I looked up from the document to see Allison staring at me with a look of absolute triumph. She was enjoying this. She was actively savoring my destruction while my husband's body was barely in the ground. The physical nausea hit me so hard I had to cover my mouth. The room began to spin. The judgmental whispers of the country club elite started buzzing in my ears like a swarm of angry bees. They were all watching the poor, pathetic widow who had been lying to herself about her marriage. My entire world was collapsing, and I had absolutely no idea how I was going to survive the next 5 minutes, let alone the rest of my life. I opened my mouth to defend him, to demand an explanation, to tear that fraudulent piece of paper into 1,000 pieces. But I never got the chance. Before my brain could command my hands to move, a set of sharp manicured nails dug viciously into my upper arm. I turned in shock to see my mother, Susan. Her face was pulled tight into a terrifyingly pleasant smile for the benefit of the watching guests, but her eyes were completely dead. She did not ask if I was all right. She did not offer a comforting embrace. Instead, she tightened her grip on my arm until it physically burned and forcefully yanked me away from the buffet table. "Stop making a scene, Lauren," she hissed under her breath, maintaining her rigid smile as she dragged me toward a secluded alcove near the coat check, safely out of earshot from the country club elite. I stumbled in my black heels, struggling to keep up with her aggressive pace. "Mom, did you hear what she just said?" I stammered, my voice trembling with a mixture of profound grief and sudden outrage. "She just accused David of stealing $250,000. She did it in front of half the town." Susan shoved me into the shadowed corner of the alcove and rounded on me, her pleasant facade instantly dropping into a scowl of absolute disgust. The heavy scent of her expensive floral perfume was nauseating in the cramped space. "I heard exactly what she said, and frankly, I am appalled at your behavior. Your sister had the courage to bring this to your attention, and you are standing there looking like a deer in the headlights trying to play the victim." Play the victim. I whispered, the sheer absurdity of her words knocking the breath out of my lungs. "Mom, my husband is dead. We just buried him. And Allison just ambushed me with a fake debt. David did not gamble. He hated crypto. That piece of paper is a complete lie." My mother crossed her arms, looking at me not like a grieving daughter, but like a stubborn employee who was failing to follow corporate policy. "Oh, stop it, Lauren. Stop being so difficult. You have always been like this. Always so dramatic, always so deeply selfish. Ever since you were a teenager, you could never just let things go smoothly. You always had to challenge everything, question everything, and make life harder for the rest of us. David clearly had a secret life, and instead of taking responsibility for the mess your husband made, you are standing here calling your sister a liar in front of my friends. The coldness in her voice was not new, but the absolute cruelty of her timing was something I could scarcely comprehend. For 35 years, I had been the family scapegoat. I was the one who paid my own way through college because their tuition fund was entirely depleted by Allison's expensive fashion school dropouts. I was the one who was expected to host every holiday, buy the perfect gifts, and remain silently in the background while they paraded Allison around like a trophy. But to do this today on the darkest day of my life was a level of betrayal I had not anticipated. You cannot possibly believe that David owed Andre that kind of money, I said, my voice dropping to a desperate plea. You knew David, you knew how careful he was. You knew how. I know that Andre is a very successful, very important man, my mother snapped back, cutting me off entirely. I know that he is providing your sister with the kind of lifestyle she deserves. And I know that he stepped in to save your husband from some very shady people, and now you are trying to default on that kindness. You should be down on your knees thanking Andre for keeping this quiet until after the funeral service. Keeping it quiet, she slammed it on the table in front of the entire country club. I argued, my hands shaking violently. Susan rolled her eyes, a gesture of pure teenage petulance on a 60-year-old woman. Because you leave us no choice, Lauren. You avoid our calls. You are stubborn. We needed to handle this immediately. Allison is getting married in exactly 8 weeks. Do you have any idea how much stress she is under right now? The caterer alone is costing a fortune. Andre has an image to maintain for his investors. I will not allow your husband's reckless financial disaster to cast a shadow over your sister's perfect day. I will not have my daughter walking down the aisle with this kind of scandal hanging over her head. I stared at her, the reality of the situation finally settling into my bones like freezing rain. A man was dead. A good, honest man who had spent the last decade treating me with the kindness my family never possessed. And my mother was worried about a caterer. She was prioritizing the aesthetic of Allison's upcoming wedding over my total financial and emotional ruin. So what exactly do you want from me? I asked, my voice suddenly devoid of all emotion, replaced by a hollow mechanical tone. Susan nodded, clearly satisfied that she had finally broken my resistance. She smoothed the lapels of her pristine black blazer. I want you to be an adult, Lauren. I want you to sell that house of yours. It is 4 bedrooms, far too big for just one person anyway. The market in your neighborhood is excellent right now. You can list it tomorrow, secure a cash buyer, and wire the $250,000 directly to Andre's firm before the end of the month. You can move into a small apartment. It will be a fresh start. But you will pay your sister's fiancé what you owe him, and you will not ruin this wedding. She spoke with the casual authority of someone ordering a coffee. She was casually demanding I render myself homeless, liquidate the life I had built with David, and hand the proceeds over to a man I deeply distrusted, all to maintain the illusion of her perfect family. She did not see me as a daughter. She saw me as an endless resource to be mined for Allison's benefit. I looked at the woman who gave birth to me, searching her face for any trace of maternal warmth, any flicker of hesitation or regret. There was absolutely nothing, just cold, calculating impatience. In that suffocating alcove, the last remaining thread that tethered me to my family completely snapped. I realized I owed them nothing. Not my money, not my home, and certainly not my loyalty. I took a slow, deliberate step backward, putting physical distance between us. I am not selling my house, I said, my voice remarkably steady. And I am not paying Andre a single dime until I see a full forensic accounting of that absurd document. Susan's face contorted in sudden rage. She reached out to grab my arm again. Now you listen to me, you ungrateful little... Do not touch me. I warned, my tone so sharp and dangerous that she actually froze mid-reach. Do not ever put your hands on me again. Before she could recover from the shock of my defiance, I turned my back on her. I pushed my way out of the alcove, ignoring the startled looks of the country club guests. I did not look back at the buffet table where Allison stood smirking. I did not look at Andre, who was watching me with a smug, predatory smile. I simply walked straight toward the heavy oak exit doors, my heels clicking loudly against the polished hardwood floor. I hit the brass push bar and burst out into the late afternoon air. The sudden rush of cool wind against my face felt like waking up from a nightmare. I practically ran across the gravel parking lot toward my car, fumbling blindly in my purse for my keys, desperate to escape the toxic gravity of my own bloodline. I reached my sedan, yanked the door open, and collapsed into the driver's seat. I hit the lock button immediately, sealing myself inside a quiet, air-conditioned sanctuary away from the polished monsters inside that country club. The moment the heavy doors clicked shut, the adrenaline that had been keeping me upright suddenly evaporated. I gripped the leather steering wheel and finally let the tears fall. They were not just tears of grief for David anymore. They were tears of absolute humiliation and betrayal. My own mother had just ordered me to make myself homeless to fund my sister's wedding, using a forged debt that smeared the memory of the most honorable man I had ever known. I leaned my head back against the headrest and forced myself to take deep, measured breaths. I am a commercial loan underwriter. I deal in facts, risk assessments, and hard data, not unchecked emotions. I wiped my face with the back of my hand and started pulling the situation apart in my mind. The story Allison told made absolutely no logical sense. David was a corporate compliance officer. His entire career was dedicated to identifying risk and stopping financial fraud. He did not gamble. We shared a bank account and I audited our finances every single month. There were no missing funds. There were no secret crypto accounts. If he had somehow incurred $250,000 in debt, there would have been a paper trail, a mortgage inquiry, a credit hit, something. But there was nothing, and the timing was far too convenient. Allison and Andre needed cash for a lavish wedding, and suddenly a mysterious debt appears exactly when they need it, conveniently tied to a man who is no longer here to defend himself. My thoughts were violently interrupted by the sharp ringing of my cell phone sitting in the passenger seat. I flinched, expecting to see my mother's name flashing on the screen, ready to deliver another barrage of insults and demands. But the screen displayed an unknown local number. My first instinct was to silence it. I was in no condition to speak to anyone, let alone a stranger. But something in my gut, an instinct honed by years of sniffing out bad loans and hidden liabilities, told me to answer. I swiped the green button and brought the phone to my ear. "Hello," I said, my voice thick and ragged from crying. "Is this Lauren?" a gravelly older man's voice asked. "Yes." "Who is this?" I asked, sitting up slightly straighter in my seat. "My name is Thomas Higgins. I am the property manager over at the Elm Street duplexes on the east side of town. I am so sorry to bother you on a day like this, ma'am. I truly am." But I did not know who else to call. I frowned, completely confused by the introduction. "Elm Street." "I do not own any property on Elm Street, Mr. Higgins. I think you have the wrong number." "No, I have the right number," he replied quickly, his tone laced with a strange, nervous urgency. "You do not own it. Your husband David rented Unit B from me. He has been renting it for the past 6 months." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. I stopped breathing. David rented a house. For 6 months, my mind raced to the darkest possible conclusions. Was he having an affair? Was he hiding a second family? Was Allison actually telling the truth about his secret debts and shady dealings? All the absolute certainty I had felt just moments ago about my husband's character began to crack under the weight of this new information. "Mr. Higgins, I do not understand," I stammered, my heart hammering against my ribs. "My husband never mentioned a rental property. What exactly is going on?" There was a heavy pause on the other end of the line. I could hear the faint sound of papers shuffling and a door creaking shut. When Mr. Higgins spoke again, his voice was hushed, almost conspiratorial. "After your husband's funeral, I was clearing the property he rented. I found something you really need to see. Come here now. Don't tell your sister or her fiancé you have to see this." A cold chill swept through the interior of my car. How did this random property manager on the other side of town know about my sister? How did he know about Andre? The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. The mention of those two specific people obliterated any thought I had about an affair. This was about something much bigger and much more dangerous. "What did you find?" I demanded, my voice rising in panic. "Mr. Higgins, what is in that house?" "I cannot explain it over the phone, Lauren. Just get here as fast as you can. It is 442 Elm Street, Unit B. I will leave the side door unlocked for you. Please hurry." The line went dead. I pulled the phone away from my ear and stared at the dark screen. My hands were shaking so violently I nearly dropped the device. A secret house. A strange landlord who knew my family's secrets. A warning specifically mentioning the two people who had just tried to extort me for $250,000. I threw the phone onto the passenger seat and reached for the ignition. The paralyzing grief that had been crushing my chest all day was suddenly replaced by a massive surge of adrenaline. The east side of town was a solid 20-minute drive from the manicured lawns of the Oak Ridge Country Club. It was an older working-class neighborhood entirely disconnected from the wealthy social circles my parents and sister orbited. If David had been hiding something over there, I needed to know what it was. And if Allison and Andre were somehow connected to this secret rental, I was going to find out how. I shoved the key into the ignition, twisted it, and the engine roared to life. I wiped the last remaining tear from my cheek, gripped the leather gear shift, and threw the car into drive. I slammed my foot on the gas pedal, the tires kicking up a spray of white gravel as I sped out of the country club parking lot. I watched the sprawling clubhouse shrink in my rearview mirror, leaving my toxic family and their fake sympathies behind. I was terrified of what I might find waiting for me at that duplex, but I was absolutely desperate for the truth. The drive to Elm Street felt like a surreal blur. I navigated my sedan away from the pristine gated communities of the Oak Ridge Country Club and crossed the river into the grittier working-class side of the city. The landscape shifted dramatically from sprawling mansions and manicured country club greens to industrial supply stores and older brick duplexes. There were no perfectly trimmed hedges or heated swimming pools here, just cracked concrete sidewalks and rusted chain-link fences. I turned down a narrow street lined with tightly packed parked cars and pulled my vehicle to the curb in front of Unit B. A worn-out truck sat idling in the gravel driveway. Standing next to it was an older man wearing faded work jeans and a heavy canvas jacket. He looked to be in his late 60s, his face weathered and deeply lined with anxiety. This had to be Thomas Higgins. I put the car in park, took a deep breath to steady my shaking hands, and stepped out into the cool evening air. Mr. Higgins watched me approach, his hands nervously fiddling with a large ring of brass keys. "Are you Lauren?" he asked, his voice much softer in person than it had been over the phone. I nodded and wrapped my black coat tighter around my shoulders against the wind. "I am Thomas," he said, taking a tentative step forward. "I manage these units. I am so sorry for your loss." "I really am. Thank you for calling me Thomas," I replied, keeping my voice as level as possible. "How did you know my phone number, eh?" He sighed heavily and rubbed the back of his neck, looking down at his worn leather work boots. "Your husband left a sealed envelope in the kitchen drawer. It had your name written on the front, your phone number, and strict instructions to call you immediately if anything ever happened to him. He was a good man, Lauren. He always paid his rent early in cash, and he was always very polite, but he was incredibly stressed. I have been managing properties for 30 years, and I know when a man is carrying a heavy burden. I could see it eating at him these last few weeks. He was not sleeping. He was just working inside that unit day and night." Mr. Higgins walked up the short flight of concrete steps to the side door of Unit B. He slid a key into the heavy deadbolt. The lock disengaged with a loud metallic click that echoed in the quiet neighborhood. He pulled the key free, turned around, and placed it directly into the palm of my hand. His rough fingers were surprisingly gentle. "I am not going to go inside with you," he said quietly, taking a step back down the stairs. "This is your family business now. But whatever he was working on in there, it is massive. You need to look carefully. Take all the time you need." With a final nod of respect, Mr. Higgins walked past me, climbed into his heavy truck, and drove away down the street. I was left standing completely alone on the small concrete porch, the brass key pressed sharply into my palm. My heart was pounding so forcefully against my ribs that it physically ached. I stared at the slightly ajar door, terrified of what lay on the other side. I braced myself for the absolute worst. My mind conjured up every horrible cliché about men who rent secret apartments across town. I prepared myself to find the undeniable evidence of a secret life. I expected to step inside and smell an unfamiliar sweet perfume hanging heavily in the air. I expected to find women's clothing draped casually over a chair or framed photographs of a completely different family. The pain of the country club ambush was still burning in my chest, but the thought of David betraying our marriage was a totally different, devastating kind of agony. I closed my eyes, gathered every ounce of courage I possessed, and pushed the heavy wooden door open. I stepped into the dark entryway and fumbled blindly along the textured wall until my fingers brushed against a plastic light switch. I flipped it upward. The overhead fluorescent tubes flickered for a second before humming to life, flooding the small room with a harsh, clinical white light. I opened my eyes, ready to let my heart shatter into a million pieces. But the breath completely caught in my throat. I did not find a romantic love nest. I did not find empty liquor bottles or a secret gambling den filled with poker chips. I walked slowly into the main living area, and what I saw completely paralyzed me. The standard living room furniture had been aggressively shoved into the far corners of the room. Taking up the entire center of the floor space were three cheap folding tables arranged in a large U shape. The tables were completely buried under towering stacks of manila folders, printed spreadsheets, and thick binders. But that was not what made my jaw drop. The walls of the living room were completely covered. Someone had gone to a hardware store, bought 4 massive whiteboards, and bolted them directly into the drywall. I walked closer, my professional instincts immediately taking over. The whiteboards were densely packed with names, corporate logos, and complex financial flowcharts drawn in David's unmistakable, precise handwriting. Red yarn was pinned to the boards, connecting different shell companies to specific offshore bank routing numbers. Printed emails were highlighted in bright yellow marker and taped next to photocopies of state tax filings. It looked exactly like a makeshift forensic accounting war room. I walked over to the folding tables, my high heels clicking sharply against the cheap linoleum floor. I picked up the top file from a stack labeled Priority Assets. Inside were hundreds of pages of printed bank statements, all heavily redacted with black marker, except for the routing numbers and transaction amounts. There were post-it notes stuck to the margins covered in David's shorthand notes. He had spent hours cross-referencing every single line item. Next to that stack was a heavy, fireproof lockbox. A ring of small keys sat right on top of it. He wanted me to find this. He knew that as an underwriter, I was the only person in his life who possessed the exact skill set required to understand the story these numbers were telling. I dropped my purse onto the floor, my eyes darting rapidly across the complex web of information on the walls. I am a commercial loan underwriter. My brain is wired to process data, track financial anomalies, and decode dense corporate structures. Looking at these boards, the fog of my grief instantly lifted, replaced by a laser-focused clarity. David was not hiding a second family, and he certainly was not losing money on crypto. My brilliant, meticulous husband was conducting a massive independent financial investigation. I stepped up to the largest whiteboard on the center wall. At the very top, written in bold black marker and circled 3 times, was the name of Andre's venture capital firm. Branching out beneath the firm's name were dozens of arrows pointing to various limited liability companies, all linked by identical dates of incorporation. I reached out and traced the red yarn with my index finger, following a line that connected a large investor deposit to a wire transfer heading straight into a private account in the Cayman Islands. My mind raced as the puzzle pieces began to snap together. This was not the work of a desperate man drowning in gambling debt. This was the work of a seasoned compliance officer systematically dismantling a massive corporate fraud. David had uncovered something incredibly dangerous, and he had been building an absolute fortress of evidence right here in this quiet suburban duplex. I stared at the name of my future brother-in-law written on the board. The man who had just stood in a luxury country club and tried to extort a grieving widow out of her home. The sheer audacity of Allison and Andre's lie became glaringly obvious. They thought they could silence David's investigation by burying me in a fake debt. They thought I was just a weak, easily manipulated woman who would panic and sell her house to save her family from embarrassment. But they made a fatal miscalculation. They forgot who I am, and they clearly did not realize the staggering amount of ammunition my husband had left behind for me to use against them. I took off my black funeral coat and draped it over the back of a cheap folding chair. The sheer panic that had gripped my chest since Allison ambushed me at the country club was entirely gone, replaced by a cold, calculating focus. In my daily life as a commercial loan underwriter, my job is to look at a mountain of financial documents and find the lie. People lie on their loan applications all the time. They inflate their revenue, they hide their liabilities, they create phantom assets to look more successful than they actually are. My entire career is built on the premise that while people lie, numbers never do. And standing in the middle of David's secret war room, surrounded by thousands of numbers, I was ready to find the truth. I pulled my hair back into a tight ponytail, grabbed a yellow legal pad from the center table, and went to work. I started with the largest whiteboard on the wall, the one with Andre's venture capital firm written at the top in thick black marker. Below it was the name of his crown jewel startup, a company called Apex Innovations. Andre had built his entire reputation in our city around Apex Innovations. According to the glossy articles my parents constantly shared on social media, Apex was developing a revolutionary artificial intelligence platform for supply chain logistics. Andre was hailed as a visionary tech founder. My parents practically worshipped the ground he walked on, parading him around their country club friends as the ultimate proof of their family's elite status. I picked up a thick binder labeled Apex Operating Accounts and flipped it open on the table. David had managed to get his hands on months of bank statements, most likely through his connections as a corporate compliance officer. I ran my finger down the debit columns, looking for the standard financial heartbeat of a tech startup. When you are building a revolutionary software platform, your operating expenses tell a very specific story. You should see massive outgoing wire transfers to cloud hosting services. You should see payroll distributions for a small army of expensive software engineers. You should see payments to legal firms for patent filings. But as I scanned page after page, those expenses were completely missing. The payroll account was virtually empty, listing only 2 administrative assistants. There were no server costs. There was no research and development budget. The core engine of this supposed tech empire simply did not exist. Instead, I looked in the credit column. The inbound wire transfers were staggering. Hundreds of thousands of dollars pouring in every single week from private individual investors. And the moment that money hit the Apex operating account, it was immediately fractured and moved out again. But it was not going toward business development. I traced David's red yarn from the printed bank statements to a cluster of highlighted emails and receipts pinned to the adjacent wall. The investor funds were being wired directly into private accounts. There were payments to a luxury car dealership for a fleet of exotic sports cars. There were massive charges for private jet charters to Monaco and Saint-Tropez. There were invoices from high-end jewelers for diamond tennis bracelets and custom Rolex watches, the exact items I had seen Allison flaunting on her Instagram account for the past 6 months. And most damning of all, a massive portion of the incoming cash was being paid right back out to early investors, labeled under vague terms like quarterly dividend distributions. I dropped the binder onto the table, my stomach turning over in disgust. It was not a tech startup. It was a textbook Ponzi scheme. Andre was not a visionary venture capitalist. He was a highly sophisticated con artist. He was using the money from new investors to fund an obscenely lavish lifestyle for himself and my sister, while using a fraction of that new cash to pay off earlier investors to maintain the illusion of profitability. The entire operation was a fragile house of cards, and David had systematically mapped out every single structural flaw. I walked slowly along the perimeter of the room, my eyes tracking a thick red string that branched off from the main Apex corporate account. It led to a small, isolated corkboard near the window. Pinned to the center of the board was a manila folder with the letters W and S, written on the tab in David's handwriting. William and Susan, my parents. My hands started to tremble again as I unclasped the folder and pulled out the documents inside. The first page was a copy of a property deed. It was the deed to their sprawling colonial home in the wealthy suburbs of Fairfield, the 4-bedroom house with the manicured lawn and the heated pool where I had grown up feeling like a prisoner in my own life. They had paid that house off entirely 5 years ago. It was their ultimate point of pride, their primary asset for retirement. But David had pulled a public records search just 4 months ago. Attached to the deed was a record of a brand new lien. My parents had quietly taken out a cash-out refinance on their property. I looked at the principal loan amount and felt all the blood drain from my face. $1.2 million. They had mortgaged every single ounce of equity they had spent their entire lives building. I flipped to the next page. It was a bank routing confirmation. 3 days after the mortgage company funded the loan, my parents wired the entire $1.2 million directly into the operating account of Apex Innovations. I stood there in the harsh fluorescent light, staring at the paper until the numbers blurred. The sheer magnitude of their foolishness was breathtaking. Andre had convinced them to gamble their entire retirement on his phantom company. He had likely promised them exorbitant returns, feeding into their obsession with wealth and status. They handed over their life savings to a man who immediately used it to buy diamond necklaces for their favorite daughter and charter jets to Europe. Suddenly, the brutal confrontation at the country club took on a terrifying new context. My mother had physically grabbed my arm, her eyes dead and desperate, demanding that I sell my own house to pay Andre the $250,000. She had framed it as protecting Allison's wedding. But looking at these documents, I realized the horrifying truth. My parents were broke. If they took out a mortgage that massive, their monthly payments would be astronomical. They were likely relying on Andre's fake dividend payouts to cover their new living expenses. And if Andre's Ponzi scheme was running low on fresh victims, those dividend checks would stop bouncing back to my parents. They were drowning. The people who had spent my entire life looking down on me, treating me like a bitter disappointment because I chose a quiet, stable career over high society glamour, were secretly standing on the edge of total financial ruin. And rather than admit they had been conned by the golden child's perfect fiancé, they were perfectly willing to destroy my life, force me to sell my home, and hand my money over to a criminal just to keep their desperate illusion alive for a few more months. A profound, white-hot rage began to boil in my chest. They thought I was weak. They thought they could bully a grieving widow into submission. They thought my husband was just a quiet, boring compliance officer who they could easily frame as a degenerate gambler. They were completely wrong. David did not just figure out their scam. He built an absolute fortress of evidence for me to use. He knew my skills. He knew I could read this room like a map. I gently placed my parents' financial death warrant back onto the table. I had found the truth about the startup, and I had found the truth about my parents' impending bankruptcy. But there was still one piece of the puzzle missing. The fake promissory note Allison had slammed onto the buffet table. The $250,000 David allegedly owed them. I turned my attention back to the center of the room. Sitting quietly on the edge of the folding table, partially hidden under a stack of tax returns, was the heavy gray fireproof lockbox. A small ring with a single silver key rested right on top of it. I reached out and picked up the key, the cold metal grounding me in the reality of what I had to do next. I gripped the small silver key and inserted it into the lock of the heavy fireproof box. It turned with a smooth and satisfying click. I took a deep breath, braced myself, and lifted the heavy gray lid. The box was not filled with cash or encrypted hard drives. Instead, nestled on top of a thick stack of paperwork, were 4 faded blue velvet jewelry boxes. I recognized those velvet boxes immediately, and my heart skipped a beat. They belonged to my grandmother, Beatrice. She had passed away 10 years ago, leaving her entire collection of antique jewelry to my mother, with the strict understanding that it would one day be divided equally between Allison and me. The collection was incredibly valuable. and was supposed to be securely locked inside the heavy steel safe in my parents' master bedroom. My mother constantly bragged about the collection to her friends, treating it like a museum exhibit that proved our family's long-standing wealth. I reached into the lockbox and opened the largest velvet case. The antique diamond choker stared back at me, gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights of the secret room. I opened the others with shaking hands. The sapphire drop earrings, the emerald cocktail ring, the platinum engagement band. They were all here. Every single piece of my family's heritage was sitting on a cheap folding table in a rented duplex across town. Why did David have my family's heirloom jewelry? I set the velvet boxes carefully on the table and reached for the thick stack of paperwork resting at the bottom of the lockbox. The top document was a bright pink carbon copy of a transaction receipt from a high-end pawnbroker located in the city diamond district. I scanned the printed text, my eyes jumping straight to the seller name line. Allison. My eyes darted to the itemized list printed below her signature. The diamond choker, the sapphire earrings, the emerald ring, the platinum band. She had pawned all of it. I flipped frantically through the rest of the pages. There were photocopies of Allison's driver's license, which she had provided to the pawnbroker to secure the cash transaction. Behind the official pawnshop documents, David had attached printed screenshots of my sister's Instagram account. He had carefully dated and cross-referenced her posts. The dates of the pawnshop cash payouts perfectly aligned with Allison's sudden and entirely unexplained bursts of extreme wealth. 3 days after pawning the emerald ring, Allison posted photos from a luxury villa in Tuscany wearing head-to-toe designer clothing. A week after pawning the diamond choker, she posted a video of herself unboxing a $30,000 designer handbag, captioning it with a quote about manifesting success and working hard. She was not a successful influencer. She was not a wealthy socialite. She was a common thief. She had stolen our grandmother's legacy, the very history of our family, and sold it to strangers so she could pretend to be rich on the internet. I kept digging through the folder, my professional instincts driving me forward. Beneath the pawnshop receipts was a standard loan agreement from the local credit union where David and I shared our joint checking account. But this loan was taken out solely in his name. I looked at the principal amount, $250,000. Next to the loan agreement was a finalized bill of sale from the pawnbroker, made out directly to David. The total purchase price to reclaim the stolen jewelry was exactly $250,000. The truth hit me so hard, I actually had to sit down on one of the metal folding chairs. My husband did not have a gambling problem. He did not make stupid crypto investments. He had somehow discovered that my sister was robbing our parents blind. But instead of letting the scandal destroy our family, instead of letting my parents experience the utter heartbreak of knowing their golden child was a sociopathic thief, David took on the burden entirely by himself. He quietly went to a bank, took out a massive personal loan against his own pristine credit, and tracked down every single piece of stolen jewelry. He bought it all back. He was holding it here in this lockbox, likely trying to figure out how to quietly return it to my parents' safe without causing a catastrophic family meltdown. He was protecting them. He was protecting me from the pain of knowing the truth about my own sister. And how did Allison and Andre repay his incredible sacrifice? They weaponized it. They clearly found out about the bank loan. They took the exact dollar amount that David had borrowed to clean up Allison's criminal mess, and they fabricated a fake promissory note around it. They knew David was dead and could not defend himself. They knew I would be completely blinded by grief. They forged a document claiming he owed that exact amount to Andre's fake investment firm, and they brought it to his funeral to extort me out of my own home. The sheer breathtaking evil of their plan was almost impossible to comprehend. They were going to use my husband's noble act to steal my house, and they were going to use my parents' blind favoritism to force me into compliance. My mother had physically grabbed my arm and ordered me to make myself homeless to pay off a debt that was actually created by her perfect daughter's theft. Suddenly, a sharp buzzing sound broke the heavy silence in the room. My phone was vibrating inside my purse on the floor. I reached down and pulled it out. The bright screen illuminated the dark interior of my bag. It was a text message from a number I had saved in my contacts years ago but rarely ever used. It was Andre. I tapped the screen to open the message. The text was short, arrogant, and dripping with fake sympathy. It read, "My lawyers are putting a lien on your house tomorrow morning. Sorry, Lauren. Family is family, but business is business. You should have just listened to your mother." I stared at the glowing words on the screen. An hour ago, a message like that would have sent me into a full-blown panic attack. An hour ago, I was a terrified, grieving widow who believed her entire world was collapsing around her. But standing in that secret room surrounded by the absolute proof of their massive financial crimes, something fundamental shifted deep inside of my chest. The tears that had been continuously flowing since the cemetery suddenly stopped. My breathing slowed down, becoming deep and perfectly measured. The suffocating weight of my grief did not disappear, but it crystallized. It hardened into an ice-cold, impenetrable rage. They wanted to play a game of financial ruin. They wanted to use legal threats and forged documents to strip me of everything I had worked for. They thought they were the smartest people in the room. But they had made one catastrophic mistake. They had handed a loaded gun to a commercial loan underwriter. I slipped my phone back into my purse. I did not text him back. I did not call my mother to argue or defend myself. Instead, I calmly reached out and began sweeping David's meticulously organized files into my heavy leather briefcase. I packed the pawn shop receipts. I packed the wire transfer records proving Andre was running a Ponzi scheme. I packed the mortgage documents that proved my parents were completely bankrupt. And finally, I carefully placed the 4 velvet jewelry boxes into the bottom of my bag. Family is family, but business is business. I repeated Andre's words aloud to the empty room. My voice sounded completely different. It was devoid of fear. It was the voice of a woman who was about to systematically dismantle the lives of the people who tried to destroy hers. I closed my briefcase, snapped the brass locks shut, and turned off the overhead lights. It was time to go to war. I did not sleep that night. I drove back to my house, locked the doors, and spent the next 10 hours meticulously organizing the evidence David had left me. I built my own physical timeline on the dining room table, laying out the fake promissory note, the pawn shop receipts, and the Ponzi scheme bank records in a chronological sequence of absolute devastation. I drank 3 pots of black coffee, my mind racing with a singular diamond-hard purpose. I was going to ruin them. By 6 o'clock in the morning, I had showered, dressed in a sharp navy blue business suit, and pulled my hair back into a severe bun. I did not look like a grieving widow anymore. I looked exactly like the senior commercial loan underwriter they had so foolishly underestimated. I poured myself one last cup of coffee and stood by the large bay window in my living room, watching the early morning sun slowly illuminate the quiet suburban street. At exactly 7:30, a massive black SUV pulled into my driveway. It was Andre's customized Range Rover, a vehicle likely purchased with the stolen retirement funds of a dozen different elderly investors. The doors opened simultaneously, and 4 people stepped out into the crisp morning air. Andre was wearing another impeccably tailored suit, projecting the image of a busy, powerful executive who was simply annoyed by a minor inconvenience. Allison stepped out next, wearing oversized designer sunglasses and holding a cup of artisan coffee, looking incredibly bored. My parents followed close behind, looking tense and irritated, likely angry that they had to wake up early to deal with their difficult daughter. And then a 5th person emerged from the back seat. He was a short, heavy-set man carrying a thick leather briefcase. He wore a cheap, ill-fitting gray suit and walked with a nervous, hurried energy. He looked exactly like the kind of low-rent corporate lawyer you hire when you need something slightly illegal done very quickly. I watched them march up my front walkway like an invading army. They did not ring the doorbell. Instead, Andre simply pounded his fist heavily against the solid oak door, the sound echoing loudly through my empty house. I set my coffee mug down on the windowsill, took a deep, steadying breath, and walked out into the foyer. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open. "Good morning, Lauren," Andre said, his voice entirely devoid of any actual warmth. His eyes scanned my business suit with a brief flash of surprise, clearly expecting to find me in pajamas, red-eyed and weeping. "We need to come inside. Now." Before I could even respond, my mother pushed her way past Andre and stepped directly into my entryway. "Honestly, Lauren, why is it taking you so long to answer the door?" she snapped, pulling off her silk driving gloves. "We have been sitting in the car for 10 minutes. This entire situation is incredibly stressful for Allison, and we just want to get it resolved so she can focus on her wedding." I stepped back, allowing the entire group to file into my house. They moved with an astonishing level of entitlement, completely ignoring the fact that they were uninvited guests in the home of a woman who had just buried her husband. Allison immediately walked over to the antique mirror in the hallway and began checking her reflection, utterly disinterested in the actual proceedings. The lawyer stood awkwardly near the coat closet, clutching his briefcase against his chest. "Let us just get this over with, my father," William said, crossing his arms over his chest. "Andre has been more than patient, Lauren. He could have taken this straight to a judge, but he wanted to handle it privately out of respect for the family. You need to do the right thing today." I looked at my father, the man who had just mortgaged his entire future to fund the criminal empire of the man standing next to him. I felt a brief, fleeting moment of pity for him, but it was quickly swallowed by the sheer audacity of his demand. "The right thing?" I asked, my voice dangerously calm. "And what exactly does the right thing look like to you, Dad?" Andre stepped forward, gesturing to the lawyer. "This is Mr. Vance. He is a partner at my legal firm. He has drawn up a simple quitclaim deed for this property. Since you clearly do not have $250,000 in liquid cash to settle David's debt, the easiest solution for everyone is for you to sign the house over to my LLC. We will sell the property, recoup the funds David stole, and you can walk away clean. We will even let you stay here for 2 weeks to pack your things." He smiled, a cold, predatory smile that made my skin crawl. He was offering me 2 weeks in my own home like it was a grand act of charity. Mr. Vance unclasped his briefcase and pulled out a stack of dense legal documents, offering them to me along with a silver pen. "Just sign at the bottom of the first 3 pages, ma'am," he mumbled, refusing to make actual eye contact with me. "It is standard boilerplate language. It transfers all equity and ownership rights immediately." I did not take the papers. I did not take the pen. I simply stood there, my hands clasped loosely in front of me, staring at Andre. "You want me to sign over the deed to my house?" I repeated, ensuring I understood the absolute magnitude of their demand. "A house that David and I paid off completely 3 years ago. You want me to render myself homeless to pay a debt that you claim my husband incurred through illegal gambling?" "Yes, Lauren, that is exactly what we want," my mother interrupted, her voice rising to a shrill, irritated pitch. "And frankly, you should be grateful. If this goes to court, it will be a public scandal. Everyone at the country club will know that David was a degenerate gambler who stole from his own family. Do you really want to drag his memory through the mud just because you are too stubborn to admit you were wrong about him?" "Stop being difficult, Lauren," my father added, his tone heavy with paternal disappointment. "Just sign the papers. Stop punishing your sister for your husband's mistakes." I looked at Allison, who had finally turned away from the mirror. She was smirking, a look of profound, arrogant satisfaction plastered across her face. She thought she had won. She thought I was completely trapped, cornered by the collective weight of my family's disapproval and Andre's legal threats. I took a slow, deliberate look at each of them. My mother desperately clinging to her false reality. My father blindly trusting a con artist. Allison, the unrepentant thief. And Andre, the architect of their impending destruction. They were standing in my foyer, aggressively trying to steal my home based on a lie, and they expected me to simply roll over and submit. "If you want me to sign a legal document," I said, my voice dropping to a low, authoritative register that I usually reserved for highly contentious board meetings, "then we are going to sit down at the dining room table like professionals. And we are going to review the original promissory note. Because I do not sign away my assets without performing my own due diligence." Andre rolled his eyes and sighed heavily, clearly annoyed that I was dragging out the process. "Fine," he snapped. "But make it quick. I have a meeting with actual investors in an hour, and I am not going to waste my entire morning dealing with your paranoid delusions." He gestured for the lawyer to follow him, and the group marched confidently past me, heading straight for the dining room. They had absolutely no idea what was waiting for them on that table. They thought they were walking in to collect their prize. They did not realize they were walking straight into a meticulously designed trap. I closed the front door, ensuring the deadbolt clicked firmly into place, locking them inside with the truth. I smoothed the wrinkles out of my jacket and followed them into the dining room. The dining room was bathed in the soft light of the morning sun. Before I had opened the front door, I had cleared away my massive timeline of their financial crimes, leaving the large mahogany table completely bare, except for a silver coffee service tray and one single slim manila folder resting exactly where I intended to sit. I walked to the head of the table, a position my father usually claimed during family dinners, and gestured to the surrounding high-backed chairs. "Please take a seat," I said, my voice smooth and perfectly measured. I poured a cup of dark roast coffee from the silver carafe and pushed it gently toward the center of the table. "Black just the way you like it, Andre." Andre glared at the coffee cup, refusing to sit down. "I am not here for a breakfast party, Lauren. I have a company to run. Sign the deed so we can all move on with our lives." My mother let out a loud, dramatic sigh and pulled out a chair, sitting down with a heavy thud. "For heaven's sake, just sit down, Andre. Let her play her little games. The sooner she feels heard, the sooner she will sign the paper and we can leave this depressing house." Allison slouched into the chair next to my mother, checking her phone and rolling her eyes. The lawyer, Mr. Vance, remained standing, clutching his briefcase against his stomach like a protective shield. He looked incredibly uncomfortable, his eyes darting between me and the exits. I took my seat at the head of the table and rested my hands flat on the polished wood. I did not raise my voice. I did not show a single ounce of the grief or anger that was burning inside my chest. I looked directly at the lawyer. "Mr. Vance, before I sign away the deed to a property I own free and clear, I require a thorough review of the original debt instrument. Please place the promissory note on the table." Andre scoffed, crossing his arms. "You saw the note yesterday at the country club." "I saw a piece of paper slammed onto a buffet table while I was mourning my husband," I corrected him, my tone sharpening just enough to cut through his arrogance. "In my line of work, we do not finalize property transfers based on fleeting glances at a country club reception. We review the original documents. Place it on the table. Mr. Vance." The lawyer looked at Andre for permission. Andre gave a stiff, irritated nod. Mr. Vance set his briefcase on the table, popped the brass latches, and extracted the promissory note. He slid it across the mahogany surface toward me. I did not immediately reach for it. I let it sit there for a long moment, forcing them to sit in the heavy silence. I took a slow sip of my coffee. "You know, Andre, I deal with fraudulent documents every single day." I began, speaking clearly and deliberately. "People are remarkably lazy when they try to steal money. They fabricate revenue, they forge signatures, but they almost always make one fatal mistake in the details. Because to them, the paperwork is just a formality to get what they want. But to an underwriter, the paperwork is the entire universe." "What are you talking about?" my father snapped, leaning forward. "Just read the document, Lauren." David signed it. The debt is real. I finally reached out and opened the folder sitting in front of me. I pulled out a red pen and leaned over the promissory note. "Let us look at the anatomy of this contract," I said, tapping the pen against the paper. "The principal amount is listed as $250,000. The borrower is listed as David. The lender is Apex Innovations. And here at the bottom we have David's signature, Andre's signature, and the official stamp and signature of a state-licensed notary public." "Exactly," Allison chimed in, not looking up from her phone screen. "It is legally binding. You lose. Just sign the house over." I ignored her completely, keeping my eyes locked on Andre. "A notary seal is incredibly important, Andre. It provides absolute legal confirmation that the person signing the document is exactly who they claim to be, and that they signed it willfully on the exact date printed on the stamp." I circled the notary stamp with my red pen, pressing hard enough to leave a deep indent on the paper. The date printed here is October 14th. According to this legally binding document, my husband sat in a room with you and this notary on October 14th, presented his state-issued identification, and signed his name to borrow $250,000. That is correct, Andre said, his jaw tightening slightly. I remember the meeting perfectly. He was desperate. He practically begged me for the money. You remember the meeting perfectly, I repeated, ensuring his lie was hanging heavily in the air. That is fascinating. Because on October 14th, my husband was not sitting in your office, Andre. I reached into my manila folder and pulled out a thick stack of medical records printed on heavy hospital letterhead. I slid them across the table so they came to rest directly on top of the promissory note. On the morning of October 12th, David suffered his first massive aneurysm. I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion, though my heart was pounding furiously. He collapsed in our kitchen. The paramedics rushed him to Mercy General Hospital. Because of the swelling in his brain, the trauma surgeons immediately placed him into a medically induced coma to try and save his life. The room went completely still. Even Allison stopped typing on her phone and looked up, her expression shifting from boredom to confusion. I tapped the medical records. These are the daily charting logs from the intensive care unit. As you can clearly see, on October 14th, the exact date you claim David was sitting in your office begging for money, he was actually lying in a hospital bed, entirely unconscious, hooked up to a ventilator with a neurosurgical monitor drilled into his skull. He remained in that coma until his heart finally stopped 3 days later. I looked up from the papers and stared directly into Andre's eyes. The color had completely drained from his face. His confident, arrogant posture collapsed. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. So, Andre, I continued, my voice echoing loudly in the silent dining room. Unless my husband somehow woke up from a deep coma, unhooked himself from life support, walked across town to your office, signed this document, and sneaked back into the ICU without a single doctor or nurse noticing. This promissory note is a complete forgery. I turned my gaze to the sweaty, nervous lawyer standing near the wall. And you, Mr. Vance, just walked into my home and attempted to use a forged legal document to extort the deed to my house. In the state of Connecticut, presenting a backdated forged financial instrument with the intent to defraud is a Class C felony. Mr. Vance let out a strange, choking gasp. He lunged forward, his hands trembling violently, and snatched the quitclaim deed off the table, shoving it frantically back into his briefcase. I did not know, he stammered, sweat beading on his forehead. Mr. Andre provided the note to me this morning. He said it was fully vetted. I had no part in drafting or notarizing that document. I withdraw my representation immediately. Before Andre could even formulate a sentence to stop him, the lawyer turned on his heel and sprinted out of the dining room. I heard the deadbolt click and the front door slam shut a few seconds later. He was gone, abandoning his wealthy client the second he realized he was being used to commit a major felony. My mother was staring at the medical records on the table, her mouth slightly open. This has to be a mistake, she whispered, looking desperately at Andre. Andre, tell her this is just a clerical error. Tell her the dates got mixed up. But Andre could not speak. The charismatic venture capitalist who had charmed his way into my parents' bank accounts was currently staring at me with the terrified realization that he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. He thought he was dealing with a naive, broken woman. He never stopped to consider that the widow of a corporate compliance officer might know exactly how to read a legal contract. The heavy thud of the front door slamming shut echoed through the house, leaving a suffocating silence in the dining room. The air felt completely static. Andre stood frozen at the side of the mahogany table, staring at the empty archway where his lawyer had just disappeared. The arrogant, untouchable aura he had carried into my home had completely evaporated. I watched the muscle in his jaw twitch. He was a man who relied entirely on intimidation and the illusion of power, and I had just stripped him of both with a single stack of medical charts. For a few seconds, nobody moved. Then the reality of the situation finally penetrated Allison's bubble of self-absorption. She looked from the empty doorway to the pale face of her fiancé, and finally down at the hospital records sitting on the table. But instead of realizing she was engaged to a criminal, her mind executed a flawless gymnastic routine of absolute denial. She slammed her hands down on the table and let out a sharp, hysterical sob. "You are lying," she screamed, her voice echoing shrilly against the walls. Her face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated victimhood. Big, crocodile tears instantly welled up in her eyes and spilled down her perfectly contoured cheeks. "I cannot believe you would do this, Lauren. I cannot believe you would stoop this low just to ruin my life." I sat perfectly still, my hands resting lightly on the table. "Do what Allison present objective facts. You forged these," she cried, pointing a trembling manicured finger at the hospital letterhead. "You printed these out to frame Andre. You have always been jealous of me. Ever since we were kids, you hated when I was happy. And now that I am marrying a successful man, now that I am having the perfect wedding, you are so bitter and miserable that you are trying to convince our parents he is some kind of criminal." The sheer delusion was breathtaking, but it was incredibly effective. The moment Allison started crying, the dynamic in the room instantly snapped back to its default setting. The golden child was in distress, and the enablers immediately sprang into action. My mother pushed her chair back so violently it tipped over and crashed against the hardwood floor. She rushed around the table and wrapped her arms tightly around Allison's shoulders, pulling her favorite daughter against her chest. "Shh, it is okay, sweetheart," Susan cooed, glaring at me with a look of absolute venom. "Do not listen to her. We know the truth." My father stood up, his face red with sudden misplaced fury. He did not look at the medical records. He actively averted his eyes from the undeniable proof sitting right in front of him. He could not afford to look at it. If he acknowledged that Andre was a fraud who forged documents, he would have to acknowledge that the $1.2 million he had wired to Apex Innovations was gone forever. His brain simply refused to process that level of catastrophic reality. "This is a new low even for you, Lauren," William spat, leaning over the table and pointing his finger directly at my face. "Your sister came here to offer you a graceful way out of your husband's disgraceful mess, and you repay her with this sick, elaborate lie. You are a disturbed woman. You need psychiatric help." I looked at my father, feeling a strange sense of detachment. I was no longer the desperate daughter begging for their approval. I was an observer, watching a group of people willingly chain themselves to a sinking ship. "Dad, the phone number for the hospital records department is printed right on the top of that page," I said calmly. "You can call them right now. They will verify every single date on those charts." "David was in a coma. Andre is lying to you." "Do not speak to me about lying," my father shouted, slamming his fist on the table. "I know exactly who Andre is. He is a brilliant businessman who has done nothing but try to elevate this family. And David was a secretive, deceitful man who hid his massive gambling debts from his own wife. You are just too proud to admit you married a loser, so you are taking it out on your sister." My mother nodded vigorously, stroking Allison's hair as she continued to weep loudly. "We are leaving," Susan announced, her voice dripping with disgust. "I will not stand in this house for another second and watch you abuse your sister. You have made your choice, Lauren. You are completely on your own now. Do not call us. Do not come to the wedding. You are no longer part of this family." They were abandoning me again. But this time it did not hurt. It felt like a massive weight was being lifted off my chest. Andre finally seemed to recover his composure. He smoothed the lapels of his expensive suit, instantly shifting back into the role of the calm, protective patriarch. He reached out and gently guided Allison away from my mother. "It is all right, Mr. and Mrs. Evans," Andre said, his voice entirely smooth, completely masking the panic that had gripped him moments ago. "We are not going to sink to her level. We will handle this through the proper legal channels. Let us just get Allison out of this toxic environment." My parents nodded in obedient agreement. They turned their backs on me and began walking toward the foyer, supporting a dramatically sobbing Allison between them. They did not look back. They marched out of the dining room utterly convinced of their own self-righteousness, marching blindly toward their own total financial ruin. Andre followed them, but as he reached the archway of the dining room, he stopped. He waited until my parents and sister were out of earshot, safely standing by the front door. Then he slowly turned around and walked back toward me. The fake charming smile was completely gone. His face was cold hard and entirely ruthless. He leaned over the mahogany table, resting his weight on his knuckles, bringing his face just a few inches from mine. The smell of his expensive cologne mixed with the bitter scent of the black coffee. "You think you are very smart, do you not?" he whispered, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. "You think because you found a little clerical error in a contract you have somehow won." "It is not a clerical error, Andre," I replied, refusing to break eye contact or lean away from him. "It is felony fraud, and you are going to prison." A dark, cruel smile spread across his lips. "You really have no idea how the real world works, Lauren. People like me do not go to prison over technicalities. We adapt, we overcome, and we crush anyone who gets in our way." He leaned in even closer, his eyes locking onto mine with absolute malice. "You are a commercial loan underwriter. Your entire career, your entire livelihood is based on your professional reputation. It is based on trust ethics and standing within the financial community." I felt a sudden sharp spike of adrenaline in my chest, but I kept my face perfectly blank. "I have friends on the board of every major financial institution in this state," Andre continued, his voice barely more than a breath. "I know the executives at your underwriting firm. I golf with them. I invest with them. You refuse to give me the house, which is a minor inconvenience. But for that insult, I am going to take everything else. I am going to file a formal ethics complaint against you by the end of the day. I am going to fabricate a story so damaging, so tied to your dead husband's fake financial crimes, that you will lose your corporate license. I am going to burn your career to the ground, Lauren. You will never work in this industry again. You will be bankrupt, disgraced, and completely alone." He held my gaze for one long, terrifying second, ensuring I understood that this was not an empty threat. He had the power, the connections, and the lack of morality to do exactly what he promised. Then he stood up straight, adjusted his tie, and walked away. I listened to his footsteps echo down the hall. I heard the front door open, the murmur of my parents comforting Allison, and the heavy thud of the door locking behind them. I was entirely alone in the house. Andre thought his threat would paralyze me with fear. He thought the prospect of losing my career would force me to back down and hide. He was severely mistaken. As I sat in the quiet dining room, looking at the absolute proof of his crimes, I realized he had just given me the ultimate gift. He had removed any lingering hesitation I might have had about destroying him publicly. He declared total war, and I was more than ready to fight back. The rest of that day passed in a strange, hyper-focused blur. I did not wait for Andre's lawyers to file their fake lien, and I certainly did not wait for my parents to call and demand an apology. I spent the afternoon securing my own legal counsel, handing over a carefully curated copy of David's hospital records and the forged promissory note. By the time the sun went down, the lawyer assured me that any attempt Andre made to claim my property would be met with an immediate countersuit for felony fraud. My house was safe. But I knew Andre was not going to stop there. He had promised to burn my career to the ground, and a man with that much unchecked arrogance always followed through on a threat. The next morning, I drove to the downtown financial district and parked my car in the secure garage beneath the gleaming glass tower of my underwriting firm. For 10 years, this building had been my sanctuary. It was a place of logic, structure, and absolute accountability, everything my family was not. I walked through the polished marble lobby, rode the elevator to the 42nd floor, and stepped out onto the plush carpet of my department. I expected a normal Friday morning, perhaps some sympathetic glances from coworkers who knew I had just buried my husband. Instead, I found my desk completely boxed up. Standing next to my empty cubicle was the department director, Mr. Harrison, accompanied by a woman from Human Resources. Neither of them made eye contact with me as I approached. The usual hum of the busy office seemed to drop to a dead silence. "Lauren, we need you to step into the conference room," Mr. Harrison said, his voice stripped of its usual warmth, replaced by a rigid corporate chill. I did not ask any questions. I walked into the glass-walled room and took a seat at the heavy oak table. The human resources representative sat across from me and slid a thick manila folder across the table, a move that eerily mirrored my sister's ambush at the country club. Effective immediately, you are being placed on unpaid administrative leave pending a full investigation by the State Ethics Board, Mr. Harrison announced, standing near the door as if he was afraid to get too close to me. I looked down at the folder. May I ask what exactly I am being investigated for? I asked, my voice perfectly level. An anonymous complaint was filed late yesterday afternoon, directly with the State Regulatory Commission. The HR representative said, her tone clipped and professional. The complaint alleges that you utilized your senior underwriting credentials to bypass security protocols and facilitate illegal offshore wire transfers. Furthermore, it claims these transfers were used to launder money for an illegal gambling syndicate operated by your late husband. Because the complaint involves federal wire fraud allegations, we are required by law to suspend your license and lock you out of the company network until the board reaches a conclusion. I sat in the cold, perfectly air-conditioned conference room and listened to the sheer perfection of Andre's sabotage. It was a masterclass in corporate destruction. He did not just try to get me fired. He weaponized my husband's death, tied it to the fake gambling narrative he had already sold my family, and used his high-level financial connections to bypass the standard HR complaints process, going straight to the state regulatory board. He knew that an investigation of this magnitude could take months, if not years, to resolve. In the meantime, I would have no income, no corporate license, and a permanently ruined reputation in the banking sector. He had executed his threat flawlessly. They expected me to break down. They expected me to cry, beg for my job, or scream about my innocence. But I did absolutely none of those things. I knew exactly who had orchestrated this, and I knew that panicking would only give him exactly what he wanted. I understand the protocol, I said calmly. I reached into my purse, pulled out my corporate security badge and my company-issued cell phone, and placed them neatly on top of the manila folder. I will fully cooperate with the state board when they reach out. Have a good weekend, Mr. Harrison. I stood up, pushed my chair back, and walked out of the conference room. I did not look back at my boxed-up desk, and I did not acknowledge the stares of my colleagues. I maintained a posture of absolute unbreakable dignity all the way down the elevator, across the marble lobby, and into the parking garage. It was only when I was safely inside my car that I allowed myself to process what had just happened. Andre had taken my career, the one thing I had built entirely on my own, the one thing that proved my worth outside of my toxic family. He thought that by stripping me of my title and my income, he would finally force me to my knees. He was wrong. By firing me, he had removed the very last chain tethering me to the rules of polite society. I no longer had a professional reputation to protect. I no longer had to worry about office politics or maintaining a quiet, dignified profile. He had pushed me completely off the board, which meant I was free to flip the entire table. I drove home with a sense of clarity so sharp it almost physically hurt. I walked into my house, went straight to the dining room, and pulled out the heavy leather briefcase I had packed the night before. I opened it and laid the contents out on the table one more time. The pawn shop receipts detailing Allison's theft. The bank statements proving Andre was running a Ponzi scheme. The mortgage documents showing my parents had bankrupted themselves for a criminal, and the 4 velvet boxes containing my grandmother's heirloom jewelry. Playing defense was no longer an option. Surviving was no longer enough. I checked the calendar hanging on the kitchen wall. Today was Friday. Tomorrow evening was the grand event my mother had been obsessing over for months. Allison and Andre's lavish engagement party. It was scheduled to be held at the Grandview Hotel, a 5-star luxury resort downtown. My mother had proudly bragged that over 200 of the city's most elite socialites, politicians, and wealthy investors were invited. It was going to be a night of opulent excess, an event designed solely to flaunt their imaginary wealth and solidify Andre's fake reputation as a tech billionaire. And the most sickening part of it all was that I knew exactly how they were paying for the champagne, the caviar, and the ballroom rental. They were paying for it with the $1.2 million my parents had foolishly handed over to a con artist. I walked into my bedroom and opened my closet. I bypassed the conservative navy suits and gray blazers I usually wore to the office. I reached all the way to the back and pulled out a stunning, deep emerald green silk dress. I had bought it years ago but never wore it, always told by my mother that it was too flashy and drew too much attention away from my sister. Tomorrow night, I wanted every single eye in that ballroom fixed directly on me. I laid the dress carefully on the bed. Then I walked back to the dining room and began packing the briefcase again. I made 50 high-quality color copies of the pawn shop receipts. I made 50 copies of the wire transfers showing the retirement money flowing directly into Andre's Cayman Islands shell company. I stacked the papers neatly, snapping the brass locks of the briefcase shut with a resounding click. Andre wanted to destroy my reputation in a private conference room. I was going to destroy his life in front of 200 of his wealthiest investors. I was going to give my family exactly what they had always wanted, a performance they would never forget. The Grandview Hotel was a towering monument to excess and architectural marvel of glass and gold leaf, located in the heart of the downtown financial district. I pulled my modest sedan up to the main entrance, stepped out into the humid night air, and tossed my keys to the valet. He blinked in surprise, his eyes darting between my practical car and the aggressive elegance of my attire. The deep emerald green silk dress flowed around my legs like liquid glass, catching the light of the crystal chandeliers hanging in the lobby. It completely erased the image of the shattered, weeping woman my family expected to see. I gripped the handle of my heavy leather briefcase, the brass locks cold and solid against my skin, and walked through the revolving doors. The engagement party was being held in the grand ballroom on the penthouse level. As the private elevator doors slid open, the sound of a live jazz quartet washed over me, accompanied by the clinking of crystal glasses and the low, self-important murmur of the city elite. I paused at the entrance, taking a moment to absorb the sheer audacity of the event. There were towering floral arrangements of rare white orchids on every table, a massive ice sculpture of a swan taking up the center of the room, and waiters circulating with silver trays of imported caviar and vintage champagne. 200 guests, dressed in bespoke tuxedos and designer gowns, were laughing, drinking, and networking. It was a flawless display of immense wealth. And as I looked at the orchids and the champagne, a cold knot tightened in my stomach. Every single flower, every drop of alcohol, and every hour of the jazz band's time was paid for by the retirement fund my parents had foolishly handed over to a criminal. I did not sneak in. I stepped squarely through the double mahogany doors and began walking directly toward the center of the ballroom. The heavy leather briefcase looked entirely out of place against my evening gown, a deliberate visual disruption that immediately drew stares from the closest tables. Heads began to turn. The conversations nearest to me faltered and died. The silence rippled outward like a stone dropped in a quiet pond, cutting through the jazz music until even the band seemed to lose their rhythm and slowly stop playing. At the far end of the room, standing on a raised velvet dais in front of a microphone stand, was my sister. Allison was wearing a custom white beaded gown that likely cost more than a down payment on a house. She was holding a glass of champagne, leaning into Andre, who was smiling his polished, predatory smile for the crowd. My parents stood proudly to their left, beaming at the investors and socialites. My mother was the first to see me. Her wine glass slipped right out of her hand, shattering loudly against the marble floor. Allison followed my mother's terrified gaze. When she saw me standing in the middle of her perfect party, looking radiant and completely unbothered, her face contorted with a mixture of sheer panic and absolute fury. But Allison was a master manipulator. She knew exactly how to play a crowd, and she knew she had to control the narrative before I even opened my mouth. Instead of screaming or running away, she quickly grabbed the microphone from the stand. Her voice boomed through the high-tech sound system, dripping with toxic, condescending sympathy. "Ladies and gentlemen, please excuse the interruption," Allison announced, pressing a hand to her chest as if her heart was breaking. That woman standing there is my older sister Lauren. As many of you know, she buried her husband just a few days ago. He left her with massive secret gambling debts, and the shock has been too much for her to bear. We tried to get her the psychiatric help she desperately needs, but the grief has clearly caused a complete mental breakdown. She has been delusional, making up horrible lies about our family, and we are just so incredibly heartbroken for her. The crowd let out a collective gasp of manufactured pity. People stepped back from me, parting like the Red Sea, treating me like a fragile, dangerous animal that had wandered into a sanctuary. My father shook his head, burying his face in his hands to play the role of the devastated patriarch. Allison pointed a manicured finger toward the back of the room. "Security, please. She is incredibly unstable and bankrupt. Please escort my poor sister out of the building before she hurts herself or ruins this beautiful evening for all of you. Let us get her back to the hospital where she belongs." Two large men in black suits immediately detached themselves from the perimeter wall and started walking rapidly toward me. They expected a hysterical woman. They expected someone who would cry, resist, or fall to the floor in a puddle of tears. They did not expect a senior commercial loan underwriter who had spent her entire career commanding rooms full of aggressive corporate executives. As the first security guard reached his heavy hand out to grab my arm, I turned and locked eyes with him. My expression was so cold, so absolutely devoid of fear that he physically hesitated. "Do not touch me," I said, my voice low but carrying a tone of absolute, unbreakable authority that cut through the silence of the room. "I am a registered guest of this hotel, and I am walking to that stage. If you lay a single finger on my dress, my attorney will own your security firm by Monday morning. Step aside." The guard blinked, thoroughly intimidated by the sheer confidence radiating from me. He looked at his partner, took a half step back, and lowered his hands. That was all the space I needed. I walked right past them, my emerald silk dress sweeping across the polished marble floor, my eyes fixed entirely on Allison. Andre stepped forward, his charismatic mask completely slipping, revealing the panicked fraud underneath. He rushed to the edge of the dais, reaching out to block the small set of stairs leading up to the stage. But I did not even slow down. I swung my heavy leather briefcase up in a tight arc, the solid brass corner catching him hard right in the center of his chest. The breath left his lungs in a loud whoosh. He gasped, clutching his ribs, and stumbled backward into a massive floral arrangement, knocking white orchids all over the floor. I glided up the steps and stepped right up to Allison. She was paralyzed. The golden child was finally completely out of her depth, trapped in front of an audience of 200 people with nowhere to hide. She held the microphone in a white-knuckled grip, her mouth opening and closing in silent shock. I reached out, pried her trembling fingers off the metal handle one by one, and took the microphone directly from her hand. I turned to face the crowd of wealthy investors, politicians, and socialites who were now staring at me in absolute breathless silence. The manufactured pity in their eyes had been replaced by intense curiosity. I placed my heavy leather briefcase heavily onto the wooden podium, popped the brass latches with a loud echoing click, and prepared to burn my family's entire fake empire to the ground. "Good evening," I said into the microphone. My voice echoed across the massive ballroom, sharp, steady, and perfectly clear. It was completely devoid of the hysteria my sister had just promised them. I did not scream, I did not cry. I spoke with the exact same corporate precision I used when rejecting a multi-million-dollar loan application. "My name is Lauren. I am Allison's older sister, and as she so gleefully pointed out, I am a very recent widow. My husband David passed away just a few days ago, and while I would normally never dream of interrupting such a beautiful celebration, my sister and her fiancé made a very public claim yesterday at his funeral reception. They claimed my husband was a degenerate gambler. They claimed he stole hundreds of thousands of dollars to fund a secret illicit lifestyle. And because I am a commercial loan underwriter by trade, I felt it was my professional and familial duty to audit their claims." The ballroom was so quiet you could hear the hum of the air conditioning vents. The 200 wealthy guests were completely captivated. The elite members of high society absolutely thrive on scandal, and they could all sense that the pristine facade of this engagement party was about to be violently shattered. I reached into my heavy leather briefcase sitting on the podium. I bypassed the stacks of paper for a moment and pulled out the 4 faded blue velvet boxes. I walked down the short set of wooden stairs, leaving the podium behind, but keeping a firm grip on the wireless microphone. I walked directly toward the front table where my parents were standing. They looked as though they had been turned to stone. "Mom, Dad, I believe you have been looking for these," I said, placing the 4 velvet boxes directly onto their table right next to a towering arrangement of white orchids. I popped the hinges open one by one. The bright, harsh light of the crystal chandeliers caught the facets of Grandmother Beatrice's antique diamond choker, the sapphire drop earrings, the emerald cocktail ring, and the platinum band. My mother let out a strangled, breathless gasp. She reached out with a trembling hand, her fingers hovering over the diamonds. "How do you have these?" she whispered, her eyes darting between the jewelry and my face. "These are supposed to be locked in the steel safe in our master bedroom. They have not been in your safe for 6 months, Mom," I said, lifting the microphone so the entire room could hear the absolute truth. They were sitting in a high-end pawn shop in the Diamond District. "Because your perfect golden child stole them from your home." A collective murmur of shock rippled through the ballroom. Allison stood frozen on the stage behind me, her face completely drained of color. "She did not lose them." I continued pacing slowly in front of the crowd like a prosecutor delivering a closing argument. "She systematically stole our family's heritage and pawned every single piece for cash. She needed the money to fund her fake glamorous lifestyle. Those luxury vacations she posted on Instagram, the designer handbags she bought this summer, they were all paid for by selling off her own grandmother's legacy to a stranger behind a bulletproof glass window." "That is a lie!" Allison suddenly shrieked from the stage, her voice cracking in pure panic. "She is making this up. She is insane." I smiled a cold, empty smile and walked back up the stairs to my briefcase. I reached inside and pulled out the thick stack of color copies I had meticulously prepared the night before. I walked back down to the front row of tables right where Andre's most prominent investors were seated. "I do not make things up, Allison," I said calmly. "I deal in hard data." I began handing the stacks of paper to the wealthy guests in the front row. "Please take one and pass it back." I brought 50 copies. "What you are holding are the original itemized pawnbroker receipts. You will see my sister's signature clearly printed at the bottom of each page, alongside a photocopy of her state-issued driver's license, which the broker required by law to process the cash payouts." The sound of rustling paper filled the room. The socialites eagerly snatched the documents from each other, adjusting their reading glasses and pointing at the undeniable proof of Allison's theft. The whispering grew louder, escalating into outright gasps of judgment and disgust. Allison's social standing was evaporating in real time, burned to ash by her own signature. But my husband found out, I announced, raising my voice to cut through the rising chatter of the crowd. David discovered what she had done. And instead of letting my parents experience the profound humiliation of knowing their favorite daughter was a thief, my husband decided to protect them. David went to our local credit union. He took out a personal loan against his own pristine credit for exactly $250,000. And he used every single penny of that loan to quietly buy these heirlooms back from the pawn shop. I pointed to the velvet boxes on my parents' table. He was holding them in a secure lockbox, waiting for the right time to quietly return them to your safe, Mom. He took on $250,000 in debt to save this family from disgrace. And how did Allison and Andre repay him? I turned around to face the stage. Andre had managed to untangle himself from the crushed orchids. His bespoke suit was rumpled, his tie was crooked, and his face was flushed purple with absolute murderous rage. "They forged a promissory note," I told the crowd, staring directly at Andre. "They forged a document claiming David owed that exact amount of money to Andre's firm. They brought it to his funeral reception yesterday and tried to use it to extort the deed to my house. They thought because I was a grieving widow, I would be too weak to fight back. They thought I would not notice that they backdated the notary stamp to a day when my husband was actually lying in a hospital on life support." The entire ballroom erupted into chaotic chatter. The word fraud echoed off the gold leaf walls. Investors were standing up from their tables looking at Andre with sudden, intense suspicion. My father William was staring at the pawn receipts in his hand, his mouth hanging open as the reality of his daughter's criminal nature finally shattered his decades of willful ignorance. Andre realized he was losing everything. The carefully constructed illusion of his wealth and power was disintegrating in front of the very people he needed to con. He let out a primal, furious roar and lunged forward, charging across the stage toward me. "Give me that microphone, you crazy!" he yelled, reaching his large hands out to grab my throat. I did not flinch. I did not run. I simply took one swift step backward, easily dodging his clumsy, rage-fueled grab. He stumbled past me, his expensive leather shoes slipping on the polished wood of the stage, forcing him to grab the podium to keep from falling off the edge. I stood right behind him, brought the microphone perfectly level with my mouth, and looked out over the sea of horrified guests. "And speaking of money," I said, my voice cutting through the chaos like a sharp blade, "I highly recommend that everyone in this room enjoy the vintage champagne and the imported caviar tonight. Please eat and drink as much as you possibly can, because you are drinking my parents' entire retirement fund." Andre froze his hands, gripping the edges of the podium so hard his knuckles turned entirely white. I looked down at my mother and father, who were now staring at me with expressions of pure, unadulterated terror. "That $1.2 million cash-out refinance you took on your home last month, Dad Andre never invested it into his tech startup. He used it to fund this party. He used it to buy his cars. Apex Innovations is nothing but a massive Ponzi scheme, and as of yesterday afternoon, the operating account holding your life savings officially hit zero." The aftermath of the engagement party was absolute devastating chaos. The moment I revealed the truth about the missing retirement funds, the ballroom descended into a frenzy. Investors surrounded Andre, shouting questions and demanding immediate access to their accounts. Allison burst into hysterical tears, sinking to the floor in her custom beaded gown, surrounded by the shattered remains of her stolen legacy. My parents had stood paralyzed, their faces ghostly pale, unable to comprehend the magnitude of their ruin. I did not stay to watch the fallout. I picked up my empty leather briefcase, walked out of the ballroom with my head held high, and rode the elevator down to the lobby in total silence. I spent Sunday in my quiet house, unplugging my landline and turning my cell phone completely off. I needed a day of absolute peace to process the adrenaline that was still coursing through my veins. The war was not over, but the major battle had been definitively won. On Monday morning, the real world came crashing back. I was sitting at my kitchen island nursing a cup of black coffee when I heard the frantic, heavy pounding on my front door. It was not the confident, demanding knock Andre had used 3 days ago. This was the desperate, erratic pounding of people who were completely out of options. I walked to the foyer and checked the peephole. It was my parents. But they did not look like the pristine, wealthy socialites they had played so perfectly at the country club. My father, William, looked like he had aged 10 years in 48 hours. His suit was wrinkled, his tie was missing, and there were dark, bruised circles under his eyes. My mother, Susan, looked even worse. Her perfectly styled hair was a mess, and her face was puffy and red from constant crying. They looked entirely broken. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open. I did not step aside to let them in. "Lauren, please," my mother gasped, reaching out to grab the doorframe to steady herself. Her voice was raspy and weak. "We need to talk to you. Please let us come inside." I looked at them, feeling an incredible sense of emotional detachment. These were the people who had ordered me to make myself homeless to fund my sister's wedding. These were the people who had blindly defended a con artist while calling my late husband a degenerate criminal. "What do you want, Mom?" I asked, my voice flat and devoid of any warmth. "We are so sorry, Lauren," my father said, his voice cracking. He actually looked down at his shoes, unable to meet my eyes. "We were wrong. About everything. Andre is not answering our calls. His office is locked. The bank confirmed the wire transfer, but they say they cannot reverse it because it was authorized. The money is gone. Our entire retirement is completely gone." I leaned against the doorframe, crossing my arms over my chest. I know it is gone, Dad. I told you that on Saturday night. My mother pushed past my father, her eyes wide with a manic, desperate energy. But it doesn't have to be, she pleaded, her voice rising to a frantic pitch. Andre texted Allison this morning. He said the company is just facing a temporary liquidity crisis because you panicked the investors. He said if we can just inject some capital into the operating account right now, he can stabilize the platform and recover our initial investment. I stared at her in sheer, unadulterated disbelief. After everything I had shown them after providing absolute documented proof of a Ponzi scheme and stolen jewelry, they were still clinging to the delusion. They were so terrified of admitting they had been conned by the Golden Child's fiancé that they were actively choosing to believe the con artist over their own daughter. "And where exactly are you planning to get this capital?" I asked, already knowing the sickening answer. My father finally looked up, his eyes filled with a horrific mixture of shame and expectation. "David's life insurance policy," he said softly. The words hung in the crisp morning air like a physical blow. I actually let out a short, incredulous laugh. "You are here to ask me for my husband's life insurance money. The husband you called a liar and a thief 3 days ago." "Lauren, you have to understand," my mother begged, tears welling up in her eyes again. "We have nothing. We are going to lose the house. We cannot pay the new mortgage. You owe us this, Lauren. We paid for your college. We housed you. We raised you. Allison is fragile. She cannot handle poverty. She is falling apart. You are tough, Lauren. You have always been the strong one. You can start over. We cannot." The sheer audacity of her logic was breathtaking. She was actually using my lifetime status as the family scapegoat as a justification to steal my financial security. Because I was tough, because I had survived their emotional neglect my entire life, I was expected to hand over the only safety net I had left, so her precious golden child would not have to experience the consequences of her own terrible choices. I looked at my parents, realizing for the final time that they would never change. They would never see me as a daughter worthy of protection. They would only ever see me as a resource to be consumed for Allison's benefit. "Come inside," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous, icy whisper. I stepped back and let them walk into the foyer. "I am going to show you exactly where your money went. And then you are going to leave my house and never come back." I turned on my heel and walked straight down the hallway toward the dining room. I did not look back to see if they were following me. I could hear the hesitant shuffling sound of their footsteps on the hardwood floor, a stark contrast to the arrogant march they had performed through my house just a few days prior. The dining room was exactly as I had left it after packing my briefcase for the engagement party. The heavy leather bag sat perfectly centered on the mahogany table, acting as a vault for their absolute destruction. I walked to the head of the table and stood behind my chair. I pointed to the 2 seats across from me. "Sit down," I commanded, my voice echoing with the strict authority of a teacher reprimanding disobedient children. My parents exchanged a nervous, terrified glance, but they obeyed. They pulled out the high-backed wooden chairs and sank into them. My father rested his elbows on the table, burying his face in his hands, while my mother sat rigidly, her eyes darting toward the leather briefcase. She was still holding on to the desperate, sick fantasy that I was going to open that bag, pull out a checkbook, and hand over my dead husband's life insurance payout to magically fix her life. I rested my hands on the brass latches of the briefcase. I popped them open. The sharp metallic click made my mother jump in her seat. "Andre told you that your $1.2 million was an emergency capital injection to stabilize his tech platform," I said, looking directly at my father. "He told you it was going to pay software engineers, cover server costs, and secure logistics patents. He promised you a massive return on your investment once the company went public. Is that correct?" My father slowly raised his head from his hands. He nodded, his eyes hollow and bloodshot. "Yes," he whispered, his voice trembling. "He showed us the projections. He had charts, Lauren. He had endorsements from major venture capital firms. He said our money was going into a secure corporate development account." I pulled a thick plastic-bound folder from the briefcase and placed it squarely in the center of the table. I flipped the heavy black cover open. "I am a commercial loan underwriter, Dad," I said, my voice ice cold. "I look at financial projections for a living. Charts can be fabricated in 20 minutes. Endorsements can be bought. But wire routing numbers are a matter of federal record. They cannot be faked. And my husband spent the last 6 months of his life tracking every single transaction Andre ever made. I slid the first document across the polished wood. It was the same bank routing confirmation I had found in David's secret war room. Look at the date, I instructed him. This is the exact day your mortgage company funded your cash-out refinance. And this is the exact hour you wired your entire life savings into the operating account of Apex Innovations. My father stared at the paper, his hands shaking violently as he reached out to touch it. He traced his own signature with a trembling index finger. Now look at the very next page, I said, flipping the document over for him. This is the official ledger for the Apex Innovations operating account. Your money landed in Andre's corporate account on a Tuesday afternoon at 2 o'clock. By Wednesday morning at 9 o'clock, every single penny of your $1.2 million was transferred out. My mother leaned forward, squinting at the highlighted lines of text. Well, of course it was transferred out, she said, her voice laced with a desperate, frantic edge of denial. He had to pay his developers. He had to pay for the servers. That is how a business operates, Lauren. You have to spend money to make money. I looked at my mother with a profound sense of disgust. Her blind devotion to the illusion of wealth was a terminal disease. He did not pay developers. Mom, I said, speaking slowly and deliberately, so she could not possibly misunderstand the words. There are no developers. There is no software. Apex Innovations does not produce a single product or service. I pulled out a massive spreadsheet printed on legal-sized paper and unfolded it across the table. I took a red pen from my pocket and circled a specific offshore routing number. When you wire money to pay a legitimate vendor, it goes to a domestic commercial bank, I explained, tapping the circled number. Andre wired your entire retirement fund to a private wealth management bank located in the Cayman Islands. The receiving account does not belong to a tech company. It belongs to a blind shell corporation called Blue Horizon Holdings, LLC. My father stared at the name. Blue Horizon. What is that? He asked, his voice barely audible. Is that a subsidiary? It is a ghost company, I replied sharply. It is a legal structure designed exclusively to hide assets from the IRS and federal regulators. And guess who the sole registered managing member of Blue Horizon Holdings is? I did not wait for them to answer. I pulled out the final devastating piece of heavy artillery David had secured. It was a dense, notarized bill of sale from a luxury maritime broker based out of Miami, Florida. I slammed it down on the table right in front of my parents. Andre, I said, answering my own question. Andre is the sole owner, and he did not use your money to buy server space. He used your $1.2 million to purchase a 65-foot luxury Sunseeker yacht. The silence in the dining room was absolute and terrifying. The air felt so heavy I could barely breathe. I pointed to the itemized receipt on the maritime bill of sale. Look at the purchase price, Dad. $1.2 million. He took the exact amount of money you bled from the equity of your home, funneled it through a fake tech company, routed it to a tax haven in the Caribbean, and used it to buy a private yacht. My father's mouth fell open. He looked from the maritime contract to the wire transfers, his eyes darting frantically back and forth as his brain desperately tried to find a loophole, a mistake, a clerical error that would prove me wrong. But there was nothing. The numbers were perfect. The paper trail was flawless. The reality of his complete financial annihilation was sitting right in front of him in black and white. No, my mother whispered, shaking her head side to side. Her hands flew up to cover her mouth. No, that cannot be right. Andre would never do that to us. He loves Allison. He is going to marry her. He promised us we would be taken care of. I leaned over the table, planting my hands firmly on the wood, bringing my face closer to hers. He is a con artist, Mom. He used his relationship with your favorite daughter to gain access to your bank accounts. He identified you as the perfect marks because you were so completely obsessed with looking rich that you handed over your life savings without asking a single intelligent question. He bought a yacht for himself and Allison to sip vintage champagne on, and he paid for it by ensuring you will spend the rest of your lives living in absolute poverty. My father suddenly let out a sound that I had never heard before. It was not a cry or a sob. It was a guttural, agonizing groan that seemed to tear its way out of the deepest part of his chest. He grabbed the edges of his own hair, pulling at it violently as his chest began to heave. The dam had finally broken. The impenetrable wall of arrogance and entitlement that had defined my father for my entire life completely shattered into a million pieces. He began weeping openly massive racking sobs that shook his entire body. "We are ruined." William choked out tears spilling onto the pristine mahogany table. "We are completely ruined, Susan. The house is gone. The retirement is gone. We have absolutely nothing left." My mother sat frozen, the manic denial finally draining out of her eyes, replaced by a hollow, vacant stare of absolute horror. She looked at the bill of sale for the yacht, then slowly looked up at me. "And you knew this," she whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and awe. "David knew this. That is why Andre tried to take your house. He was trying to silence you." "Yes," I said, standing up straight and looking down at the two people who had made my childhood a miserable, lonely experience. "David was trying to protect you. He died trying to protect you from the monsters you invited into your own home. And when he died, you stood in a country club and demanded I hand over my house to the very man who robbed you blind. And today, you had the unmitigated gall to walk to my front door and demand my husband's life insurance money so you could hand that over to him too." I closed the heavy black folder, completely sealing the evidence away. I had shown them exactly where their money went. I had forced them to look at the absolute truth of their golden child and her criminal fiancé. I had underwritten their complete destruction, and I did not feel a single ounce of pity for them. I watched my father cry. The man who had spent his entire life projecting an image of untouchable superiority, the man who had always looked at me with a mixture of boredom and disappointment, was now reduced to a trembling, pathetic shell of a human being. The sound of his weeping echoed off the mahogany walls of the dining room, a harsh and ugly noise that completely destroyed the quiet sanctuary of my home. He clutched his chest, gasping for air, as the sheer magnitude of his financial ruin crushed the last remaining breath out of his lungs. My mother did not comfort him. She did not reach out to rub his back or offer a single word of solace. Her survival instincts were entirely selfish, and right now she was frantically scanning the room, looking for a new lifeline to cling to. Her eyes darted around my perfectly decorated dining room, out into the spacious hallway, and finally settled back on my face. I could actually see the gears turning inside her panicked mind. She was calculating her options, and she was realizing with absolute horror that she had entirely run out of them. "Lauren," she choked out, her voice cracking as she wiped a streak of ruined mascara from her cheek. "The bank is going to foreclose. We have absolutely no cash reserves left to pay that massive new mortgage. Once we default, they are going to take the house. We are going to be on the street." I stood at the head of the table, my hands resting lightly on the back of my chair. I did not say a word. I simply waited for the inevitable sickening pivot. "You have 4 bedrooms," she continued, her voice trembling with a repulsive mix of maternal entitlement and sheer desperation. "David is gone. You are here all alone in this big house. We can move in with you, just for a little while, just until your father and I can contact a bankruptcy lawyer and figure out what to do next. We are your parents, Lauren. You cannot just let us be homeless. We have nowhere else to go." I looked at her, truly amazed by the bottomless depth of her hypocrisy. It was a staggering display of arrogance. 3 days ago, I said, my voice low and steady, easily cutting through the sound of my father's pathetic sobs. 3 days ago, you pulled me into a corner at my own husband's funeral reception. You dug your fingernails into my arm and you ordered me to sell this exact house. You demanded that I move into a tiny apartment so I could hand over $250,000 to a man you claimed was saving our family. You did not care if I was homeless, Mom. You did not care that I was grieving. You only cared about preserving the aesthetic of Allison's perfect wedding. That was before we knew the truth, she cried, reaching her hands across the table toward me. That was before we knew Andre was a monster. That was when you thought you had the upper hand, I corrected her, taking a deliberate step backward so she could not touch me. That was when you thought you could still use me as a human shield to protect your golden child from the consequences of her own terrible choices. But that dynamic is completely dead. My father looked up, his face red and swollen, his eyes begging for a mercy he had never once shown me. Lauren, please, he rasped. I am 62 years old. I cannot start over. I cannot work at a grocery store. We will lose all of our friends. We will be ruined in this town. Please just let us stay in the guest room. We will not be any trouble. You should have thought about your retirement before you handed $1 million to a man who bought a yacht in the Caribbean. I replied, my tone completely devoid of sympathy. I am not your safety net. I am not the backup plan you get to use when the daughter you actually love ruins your life. I turned my back on them and walked straight out of the dining room. I headed down the hallway to the foyer, my footsteps echoing sharply against the hardwood floor. I gripped the brass handle of the heavy oak front door and pulled it wide open, letting the crisp, cold morning air sweep into the house. I stood firmly beside the open door, staring back down the hallway. Get out, I commanded, my voice ringing with absolute, unbreakable authority. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then slowly, the reality of my refusal finally shattered the last remaining pieces of their delusion. They were not going to charm their way out of this. They were not going to guilt-trip me into submission. I had completely severed the strings they used to manipulate me. My father stood up first. He looked physically ill, his shoulders slumped forward as he leaned heavily against the hallway wall for support. He shuffled toward the front door like a man walking to his own execution. My mother followed close behind him, her face completely drained of color, her eyes wide with the terror of a woman who was about to lose her country club membership, her social status, and her beautiful home all in the same week. They looked like ghosts walking through my foyer. They stopped right at the threshold. My mother turned to look at me one last time. Her face was a mask of pure, unadulterated panic. Lauren, please, she whispered, her voice breaking into a fragile sob. Allison has absolutely nothing. She cannot support us. Where are we supposed to go? I looked at her, feeling a profound, overwhelming sense of closure. The scared little girl who used to paint her room blue just to avoid her mother's wrath was entirely gone. In her place stood a wealthy, independent woman who knew exactly how to read a balance sheet and how to eliminate a bad investment. You chose your daughter, I said, my voice ice cold. Now you can go live with her. I pushed the heavy oak door forward and let it slam shut right in their faces. The deadbolt clicked into place with a loud final snap. I stood in the quiet foyer, leaning my forehead against the cool wood of the door. The silence in the house was no longer heavy or oppressive. It felt incredibly light. It felt entirely peaceful. I lifted my head and looked out the narrow glass pane beside the front door. I could see my parents slowly stumbling down the driveway toward their car, clinging to each other in absolute defeat. The suburban street was usually perfectly quiet at this hour of the morning. But in the distance, cutting through the early morning fog, I saw the harsh, rapid flashing of red and blue lights. I watched as 3 massive, unmarked black SUVs with federal government plates sped past my neighborhood. Their sirens began to wail, a sharp, piercing sound that echoed through the quiet streets, heading straight toward the downtown financial district. I smiled, stepping away from the door. I had mailed David's meticulously organized files, the offshore routing numbers, the Cayman Islands bill of sale, and the forged promissory note to the regional director of the FBI Cybercrimes Division 2 days ago. Andre thought he was untouchable. He thought he could ruin my career and steal my home without any consequences. But as I watched those federal vehicles speed toward his office, I knew his fake empire was about to be violently dismantled. The war was officially over, and I had won. I walked into my living room and picked up the television remote. The morning sun was streaming through the bay windows, casting long, peaceful shadows across the hardwood floor. I sat down on the edge of the sofa and turned on the local news channel. I did not have to wait long. It was the top story on every major broadcast in the state. Breaking news banners flashed across the bottom of the screen in bright, urgent red. The camera feed showed the towering glass facade of the downtown financial building, where Apex Innovations leased their opulent penthouse office. The entire block was completely locked down. Yellow police tape was strung across the polished marble entrance. And pouring out of the revolving doors were dozens of federal agents wearing dark blue windbreakers with the letters FBI printed in bold yellow across the back. They were carrying out heavy cardboard boxes, computer towers, and stacks of hard drives. I watched the screen with a deep, profound sense of satisfaction. I knew exactly what was inside those boxes because I had provided the federal investigators with the exact roadmap to find them. David had spent 6 agonizing months compiling the evidence, and I had simply handed the final polished key to the authorities. Then the camera panned to the right, and the live feed zoomed in on the glass doors. A collective murmur rose from the crowd of reporters gathered on the sidewalk. Andre emerged from the building. He was not wearing his charismatic smile. He was not projecting the untouchable aura of a visionary tech founder. His bespoke tailored suit was rumpled, and his hands were secured tightly behind his back in heavy steel handcuffs. 2 federal agents flanked him, gripping his arms firmly as they marched him down the front steps toward a waiting armored vehicle. He looked terrified. His eyes darted wildly around the crowd, completely panicked by the sudden violent collapse of his entire criminal empire. The bright flashes of press cameras illuminated his face, capturing his absolute disgrace for the entire world to see. The news anchor spoke with a grim, practiced severity. He detailed the sheer magnitude of the charges. Andre was being indicted on multiple counts of federal wire fraud, money laundering, and embezzlement. The anchor explicitly stated that Apex Innovations was a highly sophisticated Ponzi scheme that had defrauded dozens of elderly investors out of their life savings. I turned the volume up, letting the words fill the quiet space of my living room. The reporter standing outside the building delivered the final fatal blow to Andre's legacy. He announced that a federal judge had already signed an emergency injunction. Every single asset tied to Andre and his shell corporations had been instantly frozen. His bank accounts were locked. His luxury vehicles were being impounded. And a joint task force was currently working with international authorities to seize a 65-foot yacht registered to a blind trust in the Cayman Islands. Andre had threatened to destroy my career. He had promised to leverage his powerful connections to have my corporate license revoked and leave me bankrupt and disgraced. He thought he was the smartest predator in the financial district. But as I watched the heavy steel doors of the federal transport van slam shut, locking him inside, I knew he would never see the inside of a boardroom again. He was going to spend the next 20 years of his life in a federal penitentiary. Justice had been served. Not just for the investors he robbed, but for my husband. David's name was completely cleared, and his final brilliant act of compliance work had taken down one of the most ruthless con artists in the city. I turned the television off. The screen faded to black, and the house returned to its perfect, unbroken silence. 3 weeks passed. The fallout from the engagement party and the federal raid was absolute. The local newspapers ran daily updates on the Apex Innovations scandal, and my family's name was dragged through the mud of high society. The wealthy friends my parents had spent decades trying to impress instantly cut all ties with them. The country club formally revoked their membership. And without a single dollar left to pay the astronomical mortgage they had taken out on their home, the bank initiated immediate foreclosure proceedings. My parents were evicted from the sprawling colonial house in Fairfield, forced to leave behind the manicured lawns and the heated pool that had defined their entire sense of self-worth. Allison did not escape the wreckage. During the federal investigation into Andre's finances, the authorities uncovered the massive cash payouts from the Diamond District pawnbroker. The broker, eager to avoid being implicated in a federal money laundering conspiracy, fully cooperated with the police and turned over all the security footage and signed receipts. Allison was publicly implicated in the theft of our grandmother's heirloom jewelry. She was not formally charged with a felony because my parents refused to press charges against their golden child. But the court of public opinion had already convicted her. Her social media accounts were flooded with angry comments from people she had scammed and lied to. Her fake influencer career was permanently destroyed. They had absolutely no money, no credit, and nowhere to go. They were forced to rent a single room in a cheap, rundown motel on the industrial outskirts of the city. It was the exact type of place my mother used to sneer at from the passenger seat of her luxury car. It was a Tuesday afternoon when my cell phone finally rang. I was sitting at my kitchen table, reviewing a new commercial loan application for work. My firm had completely dropped the fake ethics complaint the moment Andre was arrested, realizing the entire thing was a retaliatory fabrication. They had reinstated me with a formal apology and a significant promotion. I looked down at the glowing screen of my phone. It was an unknown local number. I answered it, placing the phone to my ear. "Hello," I said. "Lauren," a voice gasped on the other end of the line. It was Allison. She was completely hysterical. She was sobbing so hard she could barely form a coherent sentence. The confident, arrogant woman who had stood on a stage and ordered security to throw me out of a hotel ballroom was completely gone. In her place was a broken, desperate child. "Lauren, please do not hang up," she cried, her breath hitching wildly. "We have absolutely nothing. The motel smells like stale smoke and bleach. The heater does not work. Mom is just staring at the wall, and Dad has not spoken a word in 3 days. We have no money for groceries. We have been eating out of vending machines." I sat perfectly still, listening to the raw, unadulterated panic in her voice. I did not feel a single ounce of guilt. "It is so unfair," Allison wailed perfectly, executing the narcissist pivot, entirely refusing to take accountability for her own actions. "Andre tricked me, Lauren. He lied to me just like he lied to everyone else. I am a victim here. I lost my fiancé. I lost my wedding. I lost my entire life. You have to help us. You are my sister. You have a huge house. You have money. Just loan me a few $100s so we can buy some real food. Please, Lauren. I am begging you." I listened to her beg. I absorbed the pathetic, fragile state of the woman who had tormented me for 3 decades. I thought about the time she ruined my high school graduation because she was jealous of the attention. I thought about the time my mother drained my college fund to pay for Allison's mistakes. I thought about the way they treated David, a man who literally took on massive debt to save them from their own criminal behavior. And I thought about the forged promissory note she had slammed onto the buffet table at my husband's funeral. She wanted me to save her. She wanted me to revert back to my role as the family scapegoat, the reliable punching bag who would always clean up their messes when the golden child failed. I did not argue with her. I did not point out the sheer hypocrisy of her tears. I did not gloat, and I did not try to teach her a moral lesson she was entirely incapable of learning. I simply took a deep breath, feeling the absolute unbreakable power of my own independence. I pulled the phone away from my ear. I pressed the red button to end the call. Then I opened my settings and permanently blocked the number. I set the phone face down on the kitchen island. I picked up my pen, turned my attention back to the commercial loan application in front of me, and went back to work. A week after I permanently blocked my sister from my life, I took a personal day from the office and drove back to the east side of the city. The weather had shifted, leaving behind the heavy, oppressive humidity of the past month. The sky was a brilliant, flawless blue, and the crisp air felt like a physical weight lifting off my shoulders. I navigated my car through the working-class neighborhood, pulling up to the curb outside of Unit B on Elm Street. Mr. Higgins was already there, waiting by his worn-out truck, just like he had been on the day of David's funeral. But this time I was not a terrified, trembling widow, bracing myself for a devastating betrayal. I stepped out of my car wearing comfortable jeans and a soft sweater, carrying a stack of flattened cardboard boxes. I walked up to the property manager and handed him an envelope. Inside was a cashier's check covering the next 6 months of rent, along with a substantial bonus for his discretion and kindness. Mr. Higgins looked at the check, his eyes widening in surprise, and tried to hand it back to me. "I cannot accept this, Lauren," he said, shaking his head. "Your husband was a good tenant. You do not owe me anything extra. Please keep it." "Thomas," I insisted, pressing the envelope firmly back into his calloused hand. "You were the one who called me. You gave me the keys to the truth. If you had just thrown David's things away, or called my family instead, my entire life would have been destroyed. You saved me. This is just my way of saying thank you." He gave me a warm, understanding smile, tipped his faded canvas hat, and walked back to his truck. I turned around, climbed the short concrete steps, and unlocked the side door to the duplex one last time. The air inside the house was stale, smelling faintly of dry erase markers and old coffee. I turned on the harsh fluorescent overhead lights and stood in the center of the living room. The makeshift forensic accounting war room was exactly as I had left it. The folding tables were still covered in scattered files, and the massive whiteboards were still bolted to the walls, heavily annotated with the complex financial architecture of Andre's criminal empire. I spent the first hour quietly packing up the physical documents. I placed the bank statements, the offshore routing numbers, and the printed emails into a secure banker's box. The FBI already had everything they needed to keep Andre behind bars for decades, but I wanted to keep the original files. They were a testament to my husband's brilliant mind. Then I turned my attention to the whiteboards. I grabbed a felt eraser and walked up to the center board. I looked at the name of Andre's fake venture capital firm written in thick black marker. I pressed the eraser against the board and wiped it away. I moved down the line, erasing the names of the shell companies, the dates of the fraudulent wire transfers, and the intricate webs of red yarn. When I reached the corner board, I stopped. Pinned to the center was the manila folder with my parents' initials on the tab. Beneath it, David had mapped out their massive cash-out refinance and their catastrophic transfer of wealth. I pulled the pins out of the corkboard, took the folder, and dropped it into a heavy black trash bag. I did not need to keep that. I did not need any reminders of William and Susan or the millions of dollars they threw away to buy the affection of a con artist. They were officially erased from my reality. As the boards became stark white again, the frantic, desperate energy that had haunted this room finally began to dissipate. I moved into the small bedroom at the back of the duplex to pack up David's personal items. There was not much. A few changes of clothes, his favorite oversized gray sweater, a spare toothbrush, and a coffee mug he had stolen from my kitchen cabinets. I picked up the gray sweater and held it against my chest. For the first time since the day he died, my grief did not feel like a suffocating blanket of panic. It felt clean. It felt pure. I sat down on the edge of the bare mattress and let the tears fall, but they were not tears of anger or betrayal. They were tears of profound, overwhelming gratitude. David knew exactly who my family was. He knew they were toxic, manipulative, and deeply selfish. When he discovered Allison's theft, he could have easily exposed her and watched my parents' world burn. But he knew that the fallout would ultimately crush me. He knew I would be dragged into the center of their chaotic drama, so he absorbed the impact. He took on $250,000 in debt, worked in secret in this lonely duplex, and spent the last months of his life building an absolute fortress of evidence to ensure that if anything ever happened to him, I would have the weapons I needed to defend myself. He did not just leave me. He saved me. My quiet reflection was interrupted by the sharp ringing of my cell phone in my pocket. I wiped my eyes, pulled the phone out, and looked at the screen. The caller ID displayed the name of the chief executive officer of my underwriting firm. It was not my department director. It was the man who ran the entire corporate operation. I cleared my throat, smoothed the fabric of David's sweater, and answered the call. "Good afternoon, Mr. Sterling," I said, keeping my voice perfectly professional. Lauren, the CEO, said, his tone carrying a mixture of deep respect and unmistakable apology. "I am calling to follow up on the board meeting we held this morning. The State Ethics Commission formally dismissed the anonymous complaint against you yesterday afternoon. Furthermore, the federal investigators handling the Apex Innovations case reached out to our legal department. They informed us that not only were you completely innocent of the wire fraud allegations, but you were actually the primary whistleblower who provided the evidence leading to the arrests." "I am glad the board has been thoroughly briefed," I replied, walking back out into the main living room. "We are more than briefed, Lauren. We are incredibly embarrassed by how quickly the Human Resources Department acted on a fabricated complaint. We pride ourselves on the integrity of our underwriters, and you demonstrated a level of investigative brilliance that this firm desperately needs. He paused, clearing his throat before delivering the final resolution. The board has voted unanimously. We are officially offering you the position of Senior Director of Commercial Risk Assessment. It comes with a corner office, a massive salary increase, and full executive benefits. In addition, the accounting department has just wired a substantial six-figure settlement directly into your account to cover your back pay and compensate you for the extreme distress the suspension caused. I looked around the empty white walls of the duplex. The universe was completely realigning itself. Andre had tried to strip me of my livelihood, and his failure had catapulted me to the very top of the corporate ladder. I accept the position, Mr. Sterling, I said, a genuine smile finally breaking across my face. I will be in the office on Monday morning to sign the new contract. I ended the call and slipped the phone back into my pocket. The war was definitively permanently over. I picked up the single cardboard box containing David's sweater and the heavy leather briefcase containing his files. I walked out the side door, pulled it shut behind me, and listened to the deadbolt click into place. I walked down the concrete steps and out into the bright afternoon sunlight. The air felt incredibly fresh, carrying the scent of autumn leaves and distant rain. I placed the box into the trunk of my car and closed it. I stood on the sidewalk for a long moment, simply breathing in the freedom. My parents and my sister thought they could bury David's secrets along with him. They thought I was just a weak, grieving widow they could bully into submission. They forgot that David did not just leave behind a wife. He left behind a woman who knew exactly how to read the bottom line. I was 35 years old. I was a senior corporate director. I was wealthy. I was professionally vindicated. And most importantly, I was completely independent. The toxic shadows of my family would never darken my doorway again. I opened the door to my car, slid into the driver's seat, and drove away from Elm Street, heading straight into a brilliant, unwritten future.